If you were to search Sutter's Fort online, you would be told that Sutter's Fort was the first non-Indigenous community in California's Central Valley. However, Sutter's Fort was actually built entirely by the local Nisenan and Miwok population, and at least 80% of the workforce were Native people at any point in the 1840s. If you peel back the layers, though, of history here, you'll see that this is a complicated site. You'll see that Sutter's Fort is a great example of how diverse this area and California in general was prior to the gold rush. John Sutter came to California in 1839 with 10 Hawaiians at a time in history when California was claimed by Mexico. For much of the Mexican Californios, the population was a mix of Spanish, Indigenous, and African ancestry. Pio Pico, the last Mexican governor of California before American takeover in 1846, is a great example of how diverse the Californio population was. Some estimates contend that as much as 10% of California's population at the time of the gold rush was African or mixed African descent. James Beckworth and Biddy Mason are great examples of black individuals who are preserved in history because they excelled well beyond the accomplishments of ordinary people. But there are other men and women of African descent who are unmentioned or rarely mentioned by European Americans who kept first-hand accounts, such as in diaries, or people who were taking note of early 19th century history, who discounted the African population because, after all, this is a time when slavery was still legal in much of the United States. History is often based upon written and documented accounts, so those who didn't write a European language or didn't perform an exceptional deed were generally not included in historical accounts. For example, Hubert Bancroft's Pioneer Registry in his 7-volume History of California is supposed to list everyone who was here in California before the gold rush. This is an issue that Delilah Beasley found when she started researching at the Bancroft Library at the University of California, Berkeley. She found that supposedly comprehensive works like Bancroft's work focused on European American immigrants and prominent California families in California prior to 1850. She sought, though, to expand that story of early California history and covered underrepresented groups. She chronicled the history of early black individuals in California in her monumental work that was published in 1919. This comprehensive study shed light on people of color who were largely left out of early California history books. Regarding the 1840s, there are many cases of black individuals being present at many major events, as Beasley reported. During the Bear Flag Revolt, she wrote that John Grider was present, and he actually found the paint that William Todd would use to paint the bear and star on the bear flag. You have Jacob Dobson, who was traveling with John Charles Fremont and Kit Carson on their many map-making expeditions of the mid-1840s. Expanding into Gold Rush Sacramento, Beasley detailed stories of the first black public school teacher in California. That would be Elizabeth Thorne Scott in 1854 and Jeremiah Burke Sanderson in 1855. Elizabeth's school was actually in the basement of the African Methodist Episcopal Church that was founded by Daniel Blue. It is works like Delilah Beasley's research that show that expanding the narrative and including more perspectives help to give us a more holistic understanding of the past. These early historians encourage interpreters like myself to continue to do research, like combing through the archives at the State Library or the fort's records to continue to try to stitch a narrative and expand the story of sites like Sutter's Fort State Historic Park. As mentioned previously, while Sutter's Fort was a site of colonization where a large majority of the workforce were Native people, there are many mentions of people of African descent that are mentioned in letters and in journals. Of course, you have people like William Alexander Leidesdorff Jr., who had a land grant containing the land of what is now Rancho Cordova in Folsom. Leidesdorff was one of Sutter's nearest neighbors, and he was one of the richest individuals in California before the gold rush. Unfortunately, he will pass away in 1848, truly before the gold rush begins. Jim is mentioned in Heinrich Leinhardt's memoirs, and he was a farmer here. In a letter from John Sutter and Pearson Barton Redding on October 30th, 1844, he notes of 2 new employees starting at Sutter's Fort. Both were black men who were previously residing in Monterey. Myers worked in the kitchen here at the fort. And Jackson was a first-rate cooper, according to Sutter, who made wooden buckets and barrels for transporting goods from Sutter's Fort. It is little mentions like these and through more research help us to continue to understand just how diverse Sutter's Fort in California was in the 1840s, even before the gold rush.